Welcome back to the shop, everybody. Hope you all are having a good day. Today we are going to assemble an SC-V1 kit right here. We're going to assemble the primary drive and the transfer case and then do a full assembly on the chassis kit. So stay tuned. All right, so we're going to get started here. First thing you should do when you build any kit is read through the entire instruction booklet to make sure you're familiar with everything. This instruction book has 19 pages in it. The first sheet has got a description of what comes in it, optional parts, and required stuff at the bottom. This figure 1 down here in the bottom is very important. When you're putting screws into the 3D printed parts, you need to put just a minuscule little dip of grease on the end of the threads. That really helps these screws cut threads into the plastic and helps it so that they don't get too hot and gall up. Also, when you're putting the screws into the 3D printed parts, you need to, if you're using a powered screwdriver, you need to make sure that you are using low RPM and not high RPM. You don't want to get out your, 18-volt Milwaukee fuel and put this thing together. That's a bad idea. So if you're using a powered screwdriver, low RPM. And also remember to grease your screws when you put them in. This kit that I'm going to be putting together today has actually been assembled and disassembled for quality control purposes. So you will not see me greasing many, if any, of the screws, but I really want to drive home that you need to grease the screws when you're putting them in, and I'm going to remind you throughout the process too. So anyway, first sheet has got some info on it for you. The next 3 sheets are, well, sheet 2 is pretty important. You can go through and you can do a hardware count, make sure everything's in the kit. We do spot check QC the kits before they go out, and we try to do our best to make sure that every kit has everything in it, but we are human, and every once in a while a screw may get missed. So just double check your kit, make sure you got everything in it. And these are, this is printed at 1:1, so you can set a screw over the top of this and match it up to see if it's the right length or not. So there's your hardware page. Then the next 2 pages are just 1:1 outlines of all the 3D printed and carbon fiber parts that come in the kit. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to page 5 and we're going to assemble the primary drive first. So let's get after it. All right, so let's get started here. We're going to start on page 5. This is the primary drive assembly. You want to grab your bearing case here. You want to pop 3 5x11x4 millimeter bearings in here. These are 5mm ID. They should be the ones with the colored rubber seal on them. Make sure they're all the same size. You can push those all the way down in, make sure they're seated. The bearing should sit just ever so slightly below the surface of the bearing case there. Then we're going to grab our motor plate and we're going to grab some 10mm screws here. We're going to grab 5 of them. There's 5. And so what I like to do is I like to, when you're building these fresh, I like to, and also don't forget to grease your screws. But actually I'm going to show you, I've got a little tiny bit of grease over here. I'll show you what I mean. So when I say put some grease on the screws, what I mean is take a little teeny, just like, hopefully you can see that, just a tiny bit of grease on the end of the screw before you put it into the 3D printed part. So what I like to do on these is I like to start them with my hex wrench first, and then you can switch to your powered screwdriver, and then you want to get those tightened up to about 80 or 90%, and then you want to switch back to your hex driver and finish the last 5 to 10% with your hex driver. That way you're going to avoid stripping any of the holes out or anything. and the grease helps a lot with that too. These stainless, so all the hardware that comes in this kit are all 18/8 stainless steel, and they're passivated stainless, which means they kind of have a coating on them. They're stainless, and then it's something to do with the surface finish on it. So let me zip these up real quick. Okay, once you get them about that tight with the powered screwdriver, then go ahead and tighten them up the rest of the way with your hand, with your hex wrench. Anyway, what I was saying is these stainless screws seem to go into the plastic a lot better than the black oxide coated screws. These seem to be pretty slick. So anyway, there's the bearing case. So let's switch, and we're going to put this mount on here. So we're going to go this way, and this uses 8mm screws. Did I put that on the right way? I think I need to put it on this way. That's the way I need to put it on. So put this on with the part number facing the outside of the frame rail, and you want to put this on with 8mm screws. Okay, there's the passenger side mount done. So now what we need to do is we need to put our E-clip on our shaft. So this is the shaft, and you want to grab the one that's got the threads on the end of it. And then the E-clip goes in the slot here. Grab your pliers here. Snap that in, make sure that's seated all the way. That's good. And then insert that gently through your primary drive case there. Make sure it's seated all the way. Then you want to grab your 5x5 spacer, which is the 5mm ID by 5mm long. You want to slip that over. And then your 10mm dowel pin. You've got two dowel pins, one 10 and one 12. The 10mm one goes into the primary drive. You want to slip that in. And then your spur adapter goes on top of that. Make sure that's seated. Make sure that the pin is pretty well centered before you put that in and slide that on. Make sure that's fully seated, and then you put on your 4mm washer and your 4mm nut. And then you need to use a hex driver, or a nut driver, excuse me, and we're gonna tighten that up all the way. And you don't need to be He-Man and, you know, cinch the crap out of this thing, but it does need to be snug. It's a nylock, so it's not going to come off of there. So then you can use 3 6mm screws, and then we can put on the spur gear. And now these spur gears have a dual pattern in them, so you want to find the wider pattern. I believe is the one that goes onto the spur adapter. And you want to make sure you get all these started before you cinch them down, just to make sure that you're tightening it down with equal pressure, and so it's not, you know, crooked on the spur adapter or anything. So make sure you just barely snug them while you're initially putting them in, and then you can kind of tighten them up after you're done doing that. So then, yeah, I'm gonna give them a little bit of a snug. And there you have one primary drive assembled and ready to go in. All right, on to page 6. Let's assemble a transfer case. So the 4mm ID bearing, which is either going to have a black rubber shielding or it's going to be just metal shielded, that one goes in the blind hole on the top of the back half of the case. So you'll be able to tell the blind hole obviously doesn't go all the way through. So you want to push that bearing into there, make sure that's fully seated, and then the other 3 bearings go obviously in the other 3 holes, and those are going to be the ones with the colored rubber shielding on them. So let's get those pushed in, and they should seat all the way just with finger pressure. I tried to make the tolerances just right so you could snap them in with your fingers. So there's the bearings. So now what we want to do is we want to assemble the bottom shaft. And if you look on page 6, there's at the bottom of it, there's the bottom shaft assembly order. So you're going to want to put your cross pin in first, which is the 12mm cross pin or dowel pin, whichever you want to call it. Then you want to slide your gear on all the way down, and then your E-clip goes on top of that, and that way the bottom gear is captured onto the shaft. And then again, use pliers or whatever you want to get that E-clip on. And now that is nice and snug on there. Then we can take the top shaft and we can put the E-clip on the top shaft. Same deal. Pliers to get that put on there. Okay, there's that. Then we can go ahead and assemble the transfer case. So the small gear obviously goes on top. The smaller round end of the shaft goes in the 4mm hole, 4mm bearing rather. Make sure that the E-clips are facing the same direction. So you want to have them both pointing towards the front of the vehicle. And then you may have to jiggle that around a little bit to get those in there. And then front half of the case is going to go on. And then you're going to use two 16mm screws to put the case halves together, and don't forget to grease your screws. That's very important. Grease your screws. And then we'll go ahead and tighten this up. And when you get these down, I mean, you can put a decent amount of torque on these screws once you get them to the bottom and tighten them up. Don't over tighten them, but like you can, like, I mean, I'm putting a fair amount of torque on that, and you can kind of tell when they're tight enough. So just be mindful of that when you're putting it together. So there we go. There is a transfer case. All right, on to page 7. We're going to assemble some links here. So you're going to have two different sizes of links. One is 50mm that takes 3mm threads. It's 6mm diameter. And then these other ones take a 4mm thread, and they're 7mm diameter. So if you, I say it in every video, if you don't have a set of these digital calipers, you need to invest in some. This Nico brand, these here, I get these off of Amazon. They're pretty inexpensive. They're like 25 or 30 bucks, and they work really, really good. So grab yourself some of these, and then you can measure all this stuff with confidence. So anyway, let's get some links put together. This smaller one is the front upper link, and so what we're going to do first is we're going to take our two small rod ends and the two 3mm by 16 set screws, and we're going to install them into the rod ends first. Okay, so now that those are installed, you want to install them onto the link itself. And these are straight rod ends, so there's no orientation other than they just need to be parallel with each other. So just be careful when you're doing this and don't over tighten them, because you could potentially strip them out, but they usually will line up pretty good. So that is the front upper link. Let's move on to the panhard and the drag link. So these are a 4mm threaded Revo style rod end, so they're nice and tough, and they use these 4 by 20mm set screws. So let's put these in here. All right, so there's 4mm rod ends with the set screws in them. Now it's just a matter of putting them onto the link rods here, or the link tubes, whatever you want to call these. One of these does need to be clocked 90 degrees from the other end because it's the drag link. So keep that in mind. And it says that in the instructions, there's a note that says to clock one end of one of the links 90 degrees from the other one. This other one is the panhard bar, and so it should go on there straight. And that's pretty straight right there. So anyway, there we go. That step is done. All right, let's move on to page 8. Page 8, we're going to install the sliders onto the chassis rails. So it'll be pretty obvious which one goes where because they only go on one way, and you want to use 10mm screws, and don't forget to grease your screws. Always put a little bit of grease on them. Once you've done it once and you need to take something apart, then you should be fine, but on the initial assembly, you should always put a tiny dab of grease on. Make sure that they go in there nice and smooth. And that's the end of page 8. All right, let's move on to step 9. Step 9 is the page where you put all of the 3D printed items, including the primary drive, into the chassis. So what's the number one thing to remember? Grease your screws. If you look on the sheet, I'll just show this real quick. Refer to the bottom down here. This is all the different screws you need and all the different lengths. So I'm just going to get through this and show the end result, but just refer to all the part numbers and all the sizes and make sure you put all the right sizes and everything. All right, so let's continue. Okay, so there is the base chassis all put together. I haven't snugged anything up yet. I've run everything up to about 90%, and I'm just going to go through and hand tighten them all down to full tight. But you want to make sure that you don't have any twist in your chassis. You want to make sure you put the front and rear bumpers on to kind of line everything up, and then kind of not loosey-goosey kind of put everything together, make sure everything's nice and square and straight, and then you can go ahead and cinch everything down. So now that we're done with this, we're going to move on to page 10. All right, page 10. We're going to put the panhard bracket onto the front axle. There are 3 pieces to this. The 2 odd-looking ones go on the back. Well, all 3 of them are kind of odd-looking, but what I would do is I would put the 2 pieces on the back and then put the front piece on, and then you need 2 16mm screws to go in these 2 first holes here, and that kind of holds everything together. Oops. So let's snug these up. And you want to finish these off by hand, of course. And don't forget to what? Don't forget to grease your screws. Okay. That is snug. And that is snug. Let's just double check that one. Yes, that is snug. So now you want to take your front link, your upper front link goes in between here, and you want to put in the 25mm screw from this side here. And don't over tighten it. Then you want to take your panhard bar, which is, remember, the one that's got the parallel links on it, or parallel rod ends, and you want to use a 20mm screw. And you can go ahead and mount this to the axle right now as well. And remember the two rules: grease your screws and don't over tighten. There you go. You got a front upper link and your panhard bar is now mounted. So let's move on to sheet 11. All right, so if you look at sheet 11, that is installing the upper rear links on here. I just want to say a couple things about the rear links. So as you can see on the chassis itself, there are 3 positions on the chassis, and then I also offer a link riser for the rear as well. This is so that you can adjust your anti-squat to whatever you want. If you feel like you want positive anti-squat, then you would want to mount the upper rears into the lowest hole and use a link riser. If you don't want anti-squat, if you want to go to the opposite end of the spectrum, you'd want to ditch the link riser and you'd want to mount your uppers into the top hole, and that gives you the least amount of anti-squat. And you'll just have to play around with like your terrain and your driving style, and you know how your rig reacts, and adjust it as needed. So I'm actually going to combine, so sheet 11 and 12 are installing the links, and mine are already attached to the axles over here. So I'm going to go ahead and combine a few steps and do that off camera, and then we'll come back and go over some more steps. So be back in a jiff. All right, guys, so I skipped ahead a little bit here. The rest of the manual is pretty easy to follow. The rest of the kit's pretty straightforward to put together. I'm just going to refer to my little cheat sheet to make sure I don't forget to mention anything. So we installed the upper rears. I actually left my link riser on and put it in the top hole, and you'll be able to play around with that and adjust, you know, how much anti-squat you want and all that stuff. So then the next sheet, sheet 12 is, page 12 is doing the lower links. I provide the 30mm screws to get them into the skid plate. Install your servo on page 13. You can use those flat head or the big flange head Traxxas screws if you want. I really like those, the 8mm long ones. If not, you can use a regular 3mm screw with a washer on it, or you know, whatever you like to use for installing your servos. Then install the transfer case and the prop shaft in. The longer screws go in these 2 holes down here, and then the 16mm 18s in these and 16s in the other 2 holes. Then the next thing is to install the axles. So you install the axles with the standard or with the stock axial hardware at the bottom of the shock on all 4. Then on sheet 16, the front view, I've omitted a bunch of stuff from the view so that you can see everything a little easier, but it basically says when you put the upper front link on, to make sure you put the 3mm spacer on the outside of the frame rail to space it out a little bit, just to give everything room to cycle. And then on the servo horn, you want to make sure if you installed on the back side, like on the TC kit, you may experience a little bit of interference with this panhard screw right here. So you can just mount that to the front side of the servo horn if you want to give it a little space. I think in future kits I may include an offset rod end at this end to alleviate any kind of interference there, but just to make sure, just installed on the front side of the servo horn. That's the easiest thing to do. And then the upper shocks, I include screws for that and 3mm spacers for the upper end of the shock. Once you get all those things done, you can install your wheels and tires in your electronics package, and you're ready to go crawl. As far as rubber bands are concerned, you can just loop them around the axle like this, and then put them over the screw. Or if you want more tension, on my TC kit, I run it so that I have it doubled up on the front, and then I have it singled on the back. So I include rubber bands in all the kits now, so you can play around with those for how much tension you want, for to limit how much droop you're getting out of the kit. So anyway, guys, that's the complete assembly of the SC-V1 chassis kit. If you have any questions at all, I'm going to leave a link in the description for the Facebook group. That is the absolute best way to get a hold of everybody in the that deals with me, as far as like Conrad or anybody else that has a lot of experience building these kits. The group is the best way. So go ahead and go join the group. Make sure you answer the questions. And if you can't get your question answered, you can go to the website and use the contact form, or just support@negativegrc.com. You can shoot me an email and I'll do my best to help you out. So anyway, thanks for buying a SC kit, and enjoy your build. And I hope to see your build pics in the group. We'll see you guys next time.